On the night of December 18, 1944, a cold wind swept across Luxembourg City as Lieutenant General Omar Nelson Bradley studied a clutter of reconnaissance reports spread across his field desk. For 2 days straight, messages from the Ardennes front had grown progressively more dire. What Allied intelligence had confidently declared an impossible sector for a major German strike had suddenly burst open with a ferocity none of the senior leaders had anticipated. Reports from forward units painted a picture of chaos. More than 200,000 German troops, backed by close to 1,000 tanks and assault guns, had smashed into the thinly stretched American lines of the 6th Corps. Battalions were shredded, regiments scattered, entire divisions falling back in disorganized fragments. Radio nets flickered with confusion before collapsing entirely in some areas. It was as if a tidal wave had washed across a front that everyone believed was quiet and secure. Bradley rubbed his forehead, exhausted and alarmed, before reaching for the telephone. He needed to speak to George Smith Patton, Jr., commander of the Third Army, whose forces were pressing eastward into Germany. Patton answered immediately, brimming with the characteristic energy that had made him famous since the Normandy breakout. "Brad, I've got a bridgehead across the Saar," he began, practically jubilant. "Another day or two, and I'll be driving deep into Germany." Everything Third Army had been working toward. Weeks of relentless attack, grinding progress through fortified towns, bloody river crossings, had finally produced the breakthrough Patton needed for one of his sweeping armored thrusts. But Bradley interrupted. "George, we have serious trouble up north." His voice had a weight Patton was not accustomed to hearing. Bradley detailed what intelligence had pieced together. A massive German offensive, divisions overrun, the front buckling. He needed the 10th Armored Division immediately, pulled from Patton's front, and rushed north. Patton bristled at the request. Losing the 10th Armored, his best mobile reserve, would cripple his ability to exploit the Saar breakthrough. It was the culmination of a month of brutal fighting. Abandoning it felt like tossing away victory at the very moment it was within grasp. Yet Bradley insisted. Eisenhower had ordered an emergency conference at Verdun the following morning. The situation was simply too dangerous to ignore. After hanging up, Patton paced his headquarters in a slow, deliberate circle. He trusted his instincts, and something deep within them told him that this German offensive was not a limited diversion or spoiling attack. His intelligence chief, Colonel Oskar Koch, had been warning for weeks that German movements opposite the Ardennes did not match a defensive posture. Patton had not believed an attack would fall on his sector, but Koch's logic had been sound. Now, the signs pointed to a major German attempt to split the Allied front apart. Patton summoned his staff. "The Germans have launched a major offensive through the Ardennes," he said, his voice cutting through the room. "Ike wants us in Verdun tomorrow. I expect he will order Third Army to turn north and strike into the enemy's flank." The officers around him exchanged uneasy looks. Turning an entire field army 90 degrees while engaged on multiple fronts was almost unthinkable. But Patton continued without hesitation. "Start planning. I want 3 options: an attack north with 3 divisions, another with 4, and a third with 6. We present the plans tomorrow." His staff hesitated only a second before diving into the task. They all knew Patton demanded the extraordinary because he believed the extraordinary was always possible. While Patton's headquarters worked deep into the night, Bradley wrestled with his own sense of responsibility. As commander of the 12th Army Group, the Ardennes sector was ultimately under his control. He had accepted assessments that deemed the terrain too difficult for large-scale operations and had placed inexperienced American units there, assuming the region was ideal for green divisions to gain experience. Now, those choices threatened disaster. The German attack was tearing open the front, and the fate of the entire Allied line might hinge on what decisions were made in the next few days. When the morning of December 19, 1944 arrived, Verdun was gripped by a bitter cold. In a spacious yet frigid room of the ancient Caserne Maginot, 16 senior Allied commanders took their seats, wrapped in greatcoats, breaths hanging in pale clouds. Supreme Commander Dwight David Eisenhower opened the meeting with a statement that made several officers exchange doubtful glances. "Gentlemen, the present situation must be viewed not as a disaster, but as an opportunity." The German attack had torn a massive bulge in the Allied front, wreaked havoc among the defenders, and cut off entire units. Yet Eisenhower saw something deeper in the chaos. The German reserves were fully committed, their offensive momentum carrying them westward, away from their fortified defensive lines. If the Allies could contain the advance and strike from both north and south, they might trap significant German forces in the open. Eisenhower laid out the situation with crisp clarity. The German aim was to drive to the Meuse River, seize Antwerp, and split the Allied armies. At the center of their advance lay a critical crossroads town, Bastogne. 7 major roads merged there, and without those routes, the German timetable would collapse. The 101st Airborne Division, rushed forward by truck in a desperate dash, had reached Bastogne only hours before German troops surrounded it. Now the paratroopers, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division and other scattered units, were encircled. "We must hold Bastogne," Eisenhower said, "and we must relieve the defenders before they are overwhelmed." He turned toward Patton. "George, how soon can you attack north with a substantial force?" The room went silent. Every officer knew Third Army was engaged in heavy combat along the Saar. No reasonable commander could perform a 90-degree turn of 250,000 men in winter and attack within days. Patton rose from his chair, walked to the large operational map, and spoke with absolute certainty. "I can attack with 3 divisions on the morning of December 22nd. The reaction was immediate. Several British officers snorted aloud, others smiled, assuming Patton was offering trademark bravado. Bradley stared at his old friend in disbelief. The timeline was outrageous. Patton was asking the Allied command to accept as fact something that was, in practical terms, impossible. Eisenhower pressed him. "When can you actually begin the attack?" "The morning of December 22nd, Patton repeated evenly. 4th Armored Division leading, with the 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions in support. In that moment, Bradley realized Patton was not bluffing. He had seen Patton exaggerate before, but never in a strategic briefing with such stakes. If Patton said he could do it, that meant he had already laid the groundwork. And indeed he had. His staff had spent the night drawing up orders for precisely this pivot. Montgomery spoke next, explaining that his northern counterattack could not begin until the first days of January. He wanted all conditions perfect before striking. It was classic Montgomery, methodical, precise, unwilling to move without total preparation. Eisenhower weighed the contrast. One commander was asking for nearly 2 weeks. The other promised to launch in 48 hours. Eisenhower made his decision. Patton would attack from the south on December 22nd. Montgomery would reorganize and attack from the north in early January. As the meeting ended, Bradley pulled Patton aside. "George, the entire Allied command just heard you promise the impossible." Patton shrugged. "Brad, I'll be in Bastogne by Christmas." What happened next became one of the most remarkable logistical and combat maneuvers in American military history. Third Army consisted of roughly 250,000 men and more than 130,000 vehicles spread across a front oriented almost entirely toward the east. Now those forces had to disengage, pivot 90 degrees, and race north through winter storms, icy roads, and chaotic traffic, all while remaining capable of immediate offensive combat. Movement orders poured across the headquarters command net. Divisions received routes, timings, fuel allocations, and rally points. Engineers cleared roads, posted directional signs, and repaired bridges damaged by frost heave. Military police positioned themselves at intersections to prevent catastrophic traffic jams. Supply officers frantically shifted fuel and ammunition dumps northward. Communication lines were torn down and rebuilt. What should have taken weeks was condensed into hours. The winter weather was merciless. Temperatures plunged well below freezing. Snow fell in punishing bursts, turning narrow country lanes into treacherous white corridors. Steel froze, engines seized, transmissions cracked. Soldiers who had spent weeks fighting in the relatively mild Lorraine region suddenly found themselves enduring the full cruelty of the Ardennes winter. Frostbite cases skyrocketed, yet morale remained high. Patton's insistence on rigorous training, discipline, and readiness paid off. His troops understood the urgency and moved with a speed that astonished even their own commanders. The 4th Armored Division, chosen as the spearhead, began its move within hours of the Verdun meeting. These were veteran troops who had fought their way across France, experienced in rapid maneuver and combined arms action. Behind them moved the 26th Infantry Division, and behind them, the 80th. The distances they covered ranged from 75 to more than 150 miles, depending on their starting positions. And they covered them in 2 to 3 days, exactly the time frame Patton had announced to Eisenhower. By the morning of December 22nd, the divisions were in place. At dawn, Patton's attack jumped off. The 4th Armored drove straight into German defenses that had been hastily established to block any relief attempt. These German units were surprised by the speed of Third Army's movement, but they were not unprepared. They held commanding high ground, fortified villages, and roadblocks covered by anti-tank guns. The Americans advanced yard by yard through blinding snow, bitter winds, and a maze of enemy fire. Fog and low clouds grounded Allied aircraft, depriving the spearhead of vital support. Artillery struggled to reposition through the muck, and infantry slogged through frozen forests, where German ambushes waited behind every tree line. Inside Bastogne, conditions were growing desperate. Brigadier General Anthony Clement McAuliffe kept morale alive by sheer will, but ammunition was dwindling dangerously. Medical supplies were nearly gone. The wounded lay in cellars without morphine. Food had become so scarce that some paratroopers went 48 hours without a hot meal. When the Germans delivered a surrender ultimatum on December 22nd, McAuliffe's famous one-word reply, "Nuts," became a symbol of defiance, but even defiance could not stop starvation or ammunition shortages. On December 23rd, the skies cleared. Allied air power roared back with devastating effect, smashing German artillery and dropping hundreds of tons of supplies into Bastogne. The paratroopers cheered as they ran across open fields under fire to retrieve parachute bundles. Still, without a ground link, Bastogne would eventually fall. Everything depended on the relentless push of the 4th Armored Division. By December 26th, the endgame approached. The key effort fell on the shoulders of Lieutenant Colonel Crichton Williams Abrams, Jr., commander of Combat Command B's main thrust. Abrams was widely respected by his soldiers, aggressive, unpretentious, and brilliantly competent. His orders were blunt: break through to Bastogne that day, no matter the cost. He assembled a powerful task force built around Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion, supported by armored infantry and artillery. At roughly 3 in the afternoon, the column surged up the narrow, snow-choked road leading from Eisenhower toward Bastogne. German resistance stiffened immediately. Anti-tank guns opened fire, infantry fired from trenches and farmhouses, but Abrams's men kept moving. Tank guns flashed, half-tracks lurched forward, and American infantry stormed through villages, one house at a time. The column pressed ahead relentlessly. Shortly before 5 in the afternoon, Lieutenant Charles Bulge, commanding the lead Sherman tank, nicknamed Cobra King, spotted American paratroopers on the outskirts of Bastogne. Standing in his turret hatch, waving an orange air recognition panel, he rolled into Allied lines. The siege was broken. News raced through Bastogne, sparking cheers, tears, and exhausted relief. Patton's promise had been fulfilled. When Bradley received confirmation, his reaction blended awe and gratitude. He had doubted Patton's timeline, doubted whether the maneuver was even physically possible. Now, within 7 days of the first warning, the impossible had happened. Bradley phoned Patton. "George, congratulations, you did it." Patton responded with characteristic bravado. "The 101st wasn't rescued. They were fine. We just opened the door." The battle, of course, did not end with the relief. For weeks afterward, brutal fighting raged as the Germans attempted to retake Bastogne, and the Allies sought to eradicate the Bulge entirely. Yet, the moment the 4th Armored broke through became the psychological turning point of the entire offensive. It proved that the German thrust could be blunted, countered, and reversed. In the days that followed, Bradley reflected on what Patton had achieved. He praised the rapidity of Third Army's response, the discipline of its troops, and the sheer operational brilliance of turning an entire army in a matter of days. In his memoirs, Bradley wrote that Patton's performance during the Bastogne relief was perhaps his finest hour. It was a judgment born not of sentiment, but of sober military analysis. The risks Patton accepted had been immense. He stripped his front of reserves, stretched supply lines to the breaking point, and launched an attack in weather and terrain that should have made maneuver impossible. Yet his calculation about tempo, his belief that speed could outweigh risk, proved absolutely correct. When Eisenhower visited Bastogne in mid-January to award decorations, Patton and Bradley stood together in the ruined town square. Bradley later told Patton privately that historians would study the maneuver for generations. It was, he said, the most brilliant operation he had seen in the entire European campaign. Coming from Bradley, a man of deliberate understatement and cool professionalism, it was extraordinary praise. Patton's relief of Bastogne and the 101st Airborne's stubborn defense joined together as one of the most iconic episodes of the war. The paratroopers had held under impossible conditions. Patton's army had reached them through impossible odds. It was a convergence of grit, daring, discipline, and leadership that reshaped the course of the Battle of the Bulge and cemented its place in history. And for Bradley, who had struggled with doubt as the German attack broke open the Ardennes, the relief of Bastogne reaffirmed his faith in Patton's combat instincts. For Patton, still shadowed by controversies that had threatened his career, it was redemption through action, a demonstration that audacity, when united with preparation and resolve, could achieve what others deemed unthinkable. And for the soldiers of both the besieged garrison and the relieving force, it stood as indisputable proof that American troops could endure the harshest conditions, meet the most formidable enemy, and prevail.